Right. Good morning, Year 8. Here we go again. This is going to be a briefer presentation. I think I've done 4 on Richard III this week. This will be the final one on Richard III. Thus far, all we've looked at is his opening soliloquy, which is essentially the opening 40-odd lines of the entire play. But it sets up very much his intent, and it tells us a great deal about his character. Okay? The rest of the play, without just passing on, it's a wonderful play, but the rest of the play is about him manipulating those around him, being that very Machiavellian character, the person who schemes away, plots of Adelaide and all that, and how he takes the throne, how Edward IV dies, his oldest brother dies, how under Richard's influence, Edward has already put the middle brother, Clarence, in prison in the Tower of London. That happens right at the beginning of the play, right after that soliloquy. And albeit that Richard to Clarence's face says, "I'm going to help you out," essentially Richard sends his own assassins to go and drown Clarence while he bathes. Richard is then put in the position of protector, okay, of his 2 nephews, of Edward and Richard. Edward should be king, okay, Edward IV's oldest son. But he says he's putting them under protection from people in the Tower of London. And albeit there's no historical evidence of this, the chances are that Richard had those 2 boys murdered, which in itself is obviously a terrible thing. But at the same time, is it unique in the scheme of what medieval kings did in order to gain power? Well, no, it's not. Okay, these sort of things happen very, very often. One could argue, if one was being particularly in favour of Richard about this, historically, that even if he were to have done that and disposed of the bodies, considering England had been in the throes of the Civil War and the Wars of the Roses for 100 or so years, off and on, he needed to secure the throne. And of course, the Lancastrians, the other family in the Wars of the Roses, if they see the king as a little boy, they're going to be more likely to try and push for power again. So Richard needed to make sure that actually the crown was secure. You would argue probably he did it for his own gain, but there's always that argument. There's a great deal of argument, and I'll come on to this in a moment, when we talk about why Shakespeare portrayed Richard in the way that he did, to suggest that historically Richard was not a bad king, nor a bad person at all. But we'll come on to reasons for that. So the rest of the play is about Richard taking power, becoming king, and then in a very, very paranoid way maintaining the crown, keeping hold of the crown. And of course, in doing that, he starts thinking that everybody is like him. They're all scheming around him. Eventually, he does actually marry, and he's very charming to the woman he marries, using his language, not his attractiveness. But ultimately, it comes to a head, and there is a battle, as the crescendo, the climax of these plays would tend to be. There is a battle, and it's called the Battle of Bosworth Field. And the battle is between Richard, on one side, and a young pretender to the throne called Richmond, who's from a house called the Tudor. The family's called the Tudors, a Welsh family. Okay? And they meet in Leicestershire at a place called Bosworth Field in 1485. Okay? And as Shakespeare tended to do, there's a thing called a motif in Shakespeare. A motif, M-O-T-I-F, is something that regularly comes up. It's a repeated idea, repeated image, or repeated theme in a play. And one of the things, the repeated structural motifs of many Shakespeare plays is when there's a battle, they have the camp of the opposing sides of that battle the night before. And it's the case in this. Richard, we see Richmond's camp, which is nervous but confident because they feel as they're doing the right thing. And we have Richard's camp inside Richard's tent. And that night, Richard is visited, as I said before, by the ghosts of all the people that he's murdered. Now, maybe this is what he deserves, but one thing it does tell us about Richard is that he does have a conscience. there is a degree of guilt for what he's done. And I'll be talking about this when we talk about one of our heroes in Hamlet. But one of the other motifs that comes up a great deal in Shakespeare is Shakespeare tends to write about people who are highborn, kings, princes, and so on. And he always explores what it is like to be a king and have the responsibility of kingship and to be that person, the public person, but also reminding us that people like that are also human. And Richard obviously goes down in history as a villain, as King Richard III, with the hunchback, the murder of his two nephews in the Tower of London. But we always have to remember the importance of Shakespeare is the humanity of the characters. So he reminds us that the king is a king, but the king is also a man. A very famous line, a few words again, in Hamlet, when Hamlet's best friend called Horatio says that I met your father, old King Hamlet, he was a great king. And Hamlet reminds his friend, he was a man. He was a man, he was my father before he was your king. Okay? So this is about conscience. And Richard justifies his actions, he justifies his behaviour, albeit fearfully, as he probably would do the night before, night before battle and seeing ghosts. But I said the other presentation that he justifies it by saying, I am I. I am what I am. God designed me this way. I've always been treated as an outcast. I've always been treated as different. I feel isolated. I'm angry at the world. I want to change things. But essentially, I am what I am. And I have stuck to my objective throughout. Now, obviously, he's done some terrible things. But does he deserve anything in that positive column, if you like, for actually sticking to his guns, for being determined? I am determined, and he says that in his opening soliloquy. So just be mindful of that. Okay? I'm going to show you a little clip now of a very old version of the film, okay? A very old version of the play, rather, by a well-known actor, Laurence Olivier. Okay? We can see here Act 5, Scene 4, so getting towards the end of the play. Shakespearean plays tend to be broken up into 5 acts. Subdivided into scenes. At the Battle of Bosworth, Richard, the outcome is in the balance. Now, this is absolutely true. Historically, this is true. On one side, you had Richmond, Henry Tudor's army. On the other side, you had King Richard III's army. And there was deadlock. They were pretty even. If anything, Richard had the upper hand. But there was a third army. There was a third army of a family called the Stanleys. Now, Richard, in his terrible way, had taken the son prisoner of Lord Stanley. So he actually was saying, if your army joins Henry Tudor's side, I'm going to kill your son. But Stanley, making the sacrifice that he thought was right to do, joined Henry Tudor's side, and eventually that decision actually won the Battle of Bosworth in the favour of Henry Tudor, who becomes Henry VII in 1485, the first of the Tudor kings. If you remember, a couple of presentations ago, I showed you that picture of an actor called Anthony Sher, who was all dressed in black, very spider-like Richard III. Spider-like, as we said, because he creates these web of lies, this Machiavellian web. When I went to go and see that, I was lucky enough when I was probably about your ages to go and see that play. And I still recall the death of Richard III at that point. And he's on the stage, he's slumped on the stage, his crutches have been discarded, and Henry Tudor walks on, and Henry Tudor is in gold armour, and he gets his sword almost like a cross and actually puts it through Richard's hump, and Richard's just left there on the stage. Okay? Very much this idea that Richard was bad and wrong and not the legitimate king, and Henry Tudor was right. He had to get rid of Richard because Richard was so evil, and the King of England couldn't be evil. I'll come on to the justification for that. I'll come on to the reasons for that in a moment. Okay? But when we come back to Richard as well, he sees that the battle is lost. He sees that Lord Stanley has joined the other side. Does he capitulate again? Is he the man at the end of his soliloquy who says, do you know what, I'm deformed, I'm going to hide away in the shadows? When he sees Lord Stanley join the battle and the day is lost, he does make that decisive decision. The only way that I'm going to win this is if I then kill Henry Tudor on this battlefield. And he, with a few of his men, charges Henry Tudor and is cut to pieces, okay, on the battlefield. And as I said, it now goes down in history that only within the last decade have we discovered the skeleton of Richard III after that, and the rest is history. I'll put a little bit of that on so you can see. It's a very, very strange version, I hasten to add, but you'll get an idea. There's some famous lines in there. So he's saying that Richard, this is all very well known, Richard has lost his horse, which obviously for a knight is pretty important. You're much safer if you're on your horse and you can actually get away from the battlefield more quickly. Richard, we're being told here, has lost his horse. A very, very famous line, a horse, my kingdom for a horse, because he knows how important it is. And this other chap here is actually telling the other knight that Richard is on foot and is hunting down Richmond. The only way that he can win the battle is to kill the leader of the other army, the pretender to his throne.
The day is lost!
And that is Richard saying that, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. Don't make a mistake of thinking that because Richard was somehow deformed, he wasn't athletic in a way that we might think of it. You know, I'm not shaped for sportive tricks, but he was very strong, and he was a very strong warrior. There's historical evidence of that. Okay. So, I have set my life upon a cast, I will stand the hazard of the die. Again, it's that gamble. He says, you know, right from the beginning of this play, I've said this is what I'm going to do. And this other, his ally here, Buckingham, he's actually saying, you know, I'll help you escape. And Richard's saying, no. I've said what I'm going to do, and I'm going to see this through. And if it ends in my own death, then so be it. Okay? And all I'm trying to do here is say, yes, he's done some terrible things, and he is a villainous character, but he has these characteristics as well that are heroic. Do you remember that very first thing that I said to you? This idea maybe that actually sometimes heroism and villainy isn't all black and white, and there's a grey area in the middle.
I think there be 6 Richmonds in the field. 5 have I slain today instead of...
And he says, I think there'll be 6 Richmonds in the field. This is actually what they used to do in medieval battle. They used to actually have more than one person dressed as the leader of a particular army, particularly if that leader they knew was going to be focused on and followed around the field to be killed. And Richard's saying there that I've fought 5 people I thought were Richmond and killed them all. But I haven't actually killed Richmond yet. I haven't killed Henry Tudor.
A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse!
And here we have Richard cornered. Now, one thing before you actually see the death of Richard III, this is not a gory death or anything like that particularly. Certainly it's a 1940s film. One thing Laurence Olivier was very, very famous for was being a little bit over-dramatic in some of his acting. And certainly Richard, when he's in the throes of death, dies in quite a strange way. That's Lord Stanley. And importantly here, does Richard beg for his life? Does he beg for forgiveness? No. He fights, he's got 50 odd men there against him, he knows exactly what's going to happen. Okay, and that's the death of Richard III. He's the only king, English king, other than Harold II, in 1066, Battle of Hastings, to be killed in battle, which is an interesting fact. So, there we have it. Richard's dead, and we know what happens to his body thereafter. Okay. Justification of this. Why was Richard made to be such a terrible figure? Okay. And I've mentioned it before in terms of the family tree. Shakespeare was writing in the second half of the 16th century. And Richard III, for me personally, is one of the greatest plays because it is a precursor. It's something that he starts looking at very, very interesting themes in and then takes them on to his later great plays like Macbeth and Hamlet. But when Shakespeare was writing, as I said, the monarch was Elizabeth I. Okay? Now she was much more tolerant than some of her predecessors, but she would have not have tolerated Richard being written as anything other than a villainous character. Very, very importantly, I said about divine right of kings before. The Tudors, as a dynasty, as a family, were on the throne from 1485 to 1603, with the end of Elizabeth. She didn't have any children. Thereafter, you probably know that her cousin from Scotland, called James I, comes down from Scotland, the first of the Stuart kings. Okay? But that dynasty had to be what we call legitimate. It had to be a dynasty that was recognised by God. Okay? So Richard had to be made bad to make it okay for Richmond to take the throne from him, to usurp the throne. If not, Richmond would have been exactly the same as Richard. Richard had taken the throne from his nephew, and therefore he had to be get rid of. But Richmond had taken the throne from Richard, who had a better claim to it than Richmond did, so they had to make Richard bad. We had to say that this deformed man is more linked to the devil than to God, okay? In order to legitimise the whole of that dynasty, the whole of that family. Because let's not forget that Elizabeth's father was Henry VIII. Elizabeth's mother was Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth's grandfather was Henry VII, Henry Tudor, Richmond, the man who had killed Richard. Okay? That's why we have to have Richard as this terrible character, even if historically he wasn't. Now, like I said, you can pause on these things, you can read through them. This is what I think would be a good thing for you to do. I know that Miss Pano and Miss Mustafa have put on some worksheets for you. But if you've gone through, you've printed off and gone through that opening soliloquy, there's things in there and other things that I've mentioned if you've been making some notes, and you can go back and have a review of it afterwards. There should be things in there which you can fill this column with. So what I'm suggesting you do, Richard is one of Shakespeare's best villains. How does he deserve this? Is there anything redemptive? When we talk about something redemptive, can he redeem himself in any way? Can he actually take away some of all that badness? Is there anything good about him? Redemptive or even heroic about him? So what I suggest you do, based on what I've said all about Richard III, is you can divide a page into a couple of columns, okay? Richard the villain. Think about all the things that Richard has done and says to make him villainous, okay? From the opening soliloquy and from what I've just been through in this presentation as well. List them. There are probably about 5 or 6 things you could list, probably more, in terms of actions that he's taken, things he's said and so on, but always as much as you can base them on things that are said in the text. So if you're saying, well, one thing which is clearly villainous about him is the fact that he says, I am a villain. I'm going to prove myself a villain, okay? But then you could sort of take that across and say, well, at least that shows that he's honest. You could say one of the things that makes him villainous is that he loves war. Everybody else must be thinking after years of war, oh, I want peace. I want to have, a nice time to be with family and have a party and not worry about war all the time. But Richard hates peace. And think about the reasons I've given why he hates peace. When he sort of says, the dancing and the marching and the decoration and the weapons, and the grim-visaged war has smoothed his wrinkled front. Okay, sort of war as a person, a personification of war, is somehow relaxed now, and he doesn't like that. So maybe that makes him a villain. But also we can see in the end there, Act 5, Scene 4, that actually he's not only a good warrior, which is a heroic thing, but he's incredibly brave as well. He says that he is determined to prove himself a villain. Well, if there's no more evidence than we need about Richard being a villain, he says, I am determined to prove myself a villain. But surely there's something heroic about the fact he says, I'm determined to do something and see that through. The die is cast and I'm actually going to see this through to the bitter end, even if it means me dying. You could argue in a point of context that the worst thing that we think he has done is G of the heirs of Edward the murderer shall be. Gloucester himself will murder his 2 nephews. Well, that is clearly, historically, probably the most damning thing that Richard has done to make him a villain. But could we argue it was necessary? Could we? Okay? So, all I'm saying is that we need to be thinking about Shakespeare's characters as human, with human motivations. Is there anything in there that we could say about that? Is the fact that he is deformed any justification at all for what he does? Is the fact that he's so angry with God for making him that way any justification at all? Not actually a good reason, but actually a bit of an excuse for what he does. Okay. Now, give that a go. You can send me or your teacher any work that you do, even if you've just got a good understanding of it, would be great. I hope you've enjoyed actually learning about the play of Richard III. To finish off with, before we move on to the next one, which I'll film today and probably go on YouTube next week, is we're going to look at Macbeth. We're going to look at another villain in Lady Macbeth. The final thing I'll say about Richard III, it's one of, not the earliest of his plays, but it's an earlier play. And albeit it's an actual historical character, and for the reasons why he had to be made a villain, there are undoubtedly things that we notice about Shakespeare's progression. Even Shakespeare developed as a writer. Even Shakespeare developed in the quality of his writing. And what's clear is, in the character of Richard III, he sees some really, really interesting ideas. How a villain can be heroic. He sees that how someone who is a king is also a man. And those things come up very, very much in his great tragic characters of Macbeth and Hamlet and King Lear and so on. Okay, so we're going to look at Macbeth next. I hope you've understood that. And contact me if you need to.